Today we're going to make a plywood bed with a sliding headboard. I thought it would be nice to have a headboard that had some storage space in it, and sometimes I like to work on my laptop in bed, so I designed and built this sliding headboard that lets me do both. The majority of the bed is going to be made out of 3/4 inch thick plywood. I made all my cuts with a circular saw, and I clamped down a trim board to make sure that I got nice straight cuts. I'm going to be assembling the bed indoors, and I don't want to get any glue on the floor, so I put down some ram board as protection. The shelves that are going to support the sliding headboard are made out of 2 layers glued together. I applied the wood glue and then used these really handy 99-cent squeezy clamps to hold the boards in place. To keep my crosscuts nice and perpendicular, I'm going to use a speed square to guide them. Now there are 2 main sections to the bed. There's a platform that holds the mattress and then the headboard. While the glue on the headboard shelves was curing, I started working on the platform. This 2-foot by 8-foot piece of plywood is going to stick out on either side of the mattress and serve as side tables. I was just making up the design for this bed as I built it, but I'll put a link to dimension drawings for this project in the description box. These side supports will slide under that panel and will support the slats that hold up the mattress. The glue on the headboard shelves was now cured, and I was ready to cut the groove that's going to allow the headboard to slide. I set the blade on my circular saw to 15 degrees, which is a good angle for reclining, and then marked a 1/4 inch groove 3/4 of an inch in from the edge. I made a series of cuts about 3/8 of an inch deep, and I just kept adjusting my guide board a little bit each time. The result was a nice clean angled groove, and my piece of 2-inch aluminum flat bar slid right in. I then lowered the blade on the circular saw and cut all the way through. The lower shelf doesn't need a groove, so I just had to cut this all the way through, once again at a 15-degree angle. Up next, I had to cut spacers and supports that would go in between these angled shelves. Now, the distance between them is important because I want the angled faces of them to align. A 2x4 was a little bit too wide, and I didn't have any 2x2s, so I just ripped a 2x4 into 2 to use as support pieces. I glued these pieces to the plywood spacers that are going in between the angled shelves, and added in some screws as well, making sure not to screw all the way through the face of the plywood. I glued and screwed on some perpendicular supports, and then started assembling this set of angled shelves. This pine plywood was already sanded on the faces, so I just used my orbital sander to sand along the edges and touch up the faces just in a few places where I'd scratched the plywood while moving it. As much as possible, I'm trying to add in screws in places where the heads won't show. So I'm assembling this upside down where I can screw through the cut down 2x4s into the doubled up plywood, and then I can put on the bottom shelf and screw through that and into the plywood spacers. It's unlikely that anyone would be low enough to see up and under this plywood shelf and see those screw heads. I cut the back panel for the headboard 31 inches wide. Now, I would have gone a little bit taller with it, but there is a light switch right where this bed is going. I then placed the angled shelves 1.5 inches from the top and used these ripped down pieces of 2x4 to screw it to the back panel. I added a few screws through the front face of the shelves just to give it enough support so that I could tilt it up and then screw through the back panel and into the edges of the doubled up plywood. I then cut some 1-inch wide panels to go on either side. I just lined these panels up with the edge of the back panels and then used 2-inch long finish screws to attach them. Now that the headboard can support itself, I was ready to go back to the platform. I laid out the pieces and then measured the distance between them so that I could cut 2 pieces of plywood that would create a half lap joint with the side supports. And I glued these together as well. Now, it would have been easier if I just would have glued and screwed everything together all at once, but I want to be able to take this bed apart and move it in a series of large pieces, so that's why I was careful with not just gluing everything together. I laid out the pieces upside down and then placed a couple of 2x4s and screwed those to the underside of the plywood side panels. I then screwed a strip of plywood that was 4.5 inches wide to that 2x4. Now, if you want the bed to be higher off the ground, all you have to do is use wider pieces of plywood here. I then used some shorter pieces of plywood the same width and some short pieces of 2x4 to make nice solid supports that the whole bed is going to rest upon. Now this bed is pretty low to the ground, so this isn't totally needed, but I cut a piece of plywood to serve as the front face. I took some of the leftover pieces and screwed together another support the same height as the others. This is just going to allow me to have something to rest the big back panel on while I put everything into place. I like to have positive stops when I'm assembling something so I can keep everything square. So I also made another support with half lap joints that I can use towards the back of the platform as a spacer. These extra supports and spacers make it a little bit easier when you're assembling it by yourself. Everything was going together nicely, and I just wanted to add in one more set of shelves and a hidden compartment behind the mattress where you can store extra bedding. These are just made out of pieces of plywood with 2x4s to add a little bit of extra support. The tops of these shelves on the sides of the mattress are going to be made out of 2 layers of plywood glued together with a half lap joint, so that I can then make a lid for the hidden linen compartment that fits right in between them. This whole project went together pretty quickly, and the only tedious part was just the edge sanding on the layered plywood. I screwed these shelves down to the spacers, but didn't screw them to the headboard just yet. I still have to clear coat everything. I also used my orbital sander just to clean up some of the rough edges of the plywood. Now there's not that many screw heads that are showing, but if you want to cover them up with some putty, it doesn't take very long. With just a little bit of sanding, you can bring everything nice and flush. Now for projects like this, I like to clear coat it with Varathane, water-based polyurethane, and crystal clear matte. What I really like about this finish is that it doesn't make it look too honey-colored the way an oil would on this pine plywood. And it's also a low VOC finish, which is great because that means you're not getting a lot of off-gassing while you're sleeping. I used a foam brush to apply it and ended up doing 2 coats. While the polyurethane was drying, I cut some slats, and I just got some really cheap 1x3s, which were just about $1 a piece. This video is sponsored by Tuft & Needle. They make some really incredible mattresses, but one of the reasons why I was so excited to work with them is that they're really just committed to bedding in general. They also make these incredible linen sheets, which you're going to see in a little bit. And one of the things that I found really appealing about them, in addition to the quality of their products, was that they were really committed to not just getting their brand out there for a single project, but they wanted me to create a whole library of DIY bed projects. So this is just actually one of 4 projects that you're going to see this year. And this commitment is huge because it lets me experiment in a variety of different ways to make different beds that meet different lifestyle needs. Here we're using a queen size mattress from their premium line called Mint. If you click on the link in the description box below, you can see the full line of quality mattresses that they offer. I have tried quite a few different mattresses over the years, and I can attest that these are by far the best I have used. At this point, I was ready to add a few screws to secure the whole bed together and start working on the headboards. At first, I thought I would make 2 separate headboards that would allow more access to the shelves behind, so I cut down some pieces of plywood and some pieces of 2-inch wide aluminum bar to make these 18-inch long tracks. I drilled holes through the aluminum and screwed that to the plywood spacer with just about 1/4 inch of overhang. The aluminum fits right into the angled groove, and the plywood spacer comes out flush to the edges of the angled shelves. From there, I just have to screw it onto a piece of plywood, and I have a nice sliding headboard. Now, in addition to the super comfortable mattresses, Tuft & Needle also makes really nice modern looking linen bedding. I love solid color bedding, and I love the texture of linen. I just think it looks modern but still looks like real tactile materials. Everything came from Tuft & Needles. The sheets, the duvet cover, and the pillows and pillowcases all are of the same matching nice linen. I started making the bed and everything looked great, but I still wasn't totally sold on the idea of two separate movable headboards, so I decided to try to make a single one instead. So I cut a rectangular piece of plywood 4 feet long, and I wanted to round over the corners, but I didn't have a jigsaw with me, so instead I just made 2 cuts with my circular saw and then slightly rounded over these angles with my orbital sander. I screwed on a spacer piece of plywood and a 2-inch aluminum bar and switched out the 2 individual headboards with a single one. Now I like the look of the single headboard better, but it does have to be removed when you want to access the hidden linen storage. One other thing I forgot to mention was that I drilled some large 2-inch diameter holes in the back panel that aligned with the location of the outlets in the wall. This way I can still access the plugs. I'm really happy with how this project came out. The materials cost me less than $200 and I only needed 3 power tools, a circular saw, drill, and orbital sander to make it. Thanks to Tuft & Needle for sponsoring this project. If you're interested in building it yourself, I'll put links to a full blog post in the description box below. Check out some of our other videos and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks. Bye.